Thank you, Patrick. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our April Catalyze webinar. We have an excellent presentation put together for you today, so I will keep my introductory comments brief, but my name is Marissa Eastman. I work for RTI International, and I'm very pleased to welcome and announce my colleagues, Vernon and Brailey Faris of RTI Innovation Advisors. We will also be joined by Shweta Matter at the end of the presentation today for the question and answer period. Emily and Brailey, as well as Shweta, all support our Catalyze investigators from the perspective of RTI Innovation Advisors, who offer kind of boutique counseling and market commercialization expertise for technologies advancing towards the market. So with that, I am so happy to turn the webinar over to Emily and Brailey.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Marissa. I'm glad to be here. And do just want to note that I do think Shweta is online now. So if you do send a question in the chat, there is a chance that she will answer it prior to the end of the session. But again, we will have that Q&A towards the end as well. But I think with that, Emily, you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. Awesome. So today, Emily and I will be covering two different market sizing methodologies that can be used to help understand, again, the size of the market opportunity. So those two approaches that we'll be going over today are the top-down approach, as well as the bottom-up approach. For the top-down approach, I'll cover the methodology of how to use this, some best practices and watchouts to keep in mind, as well as a case study to put the approach into a more tangible example. And for the bottom-up approach, Emily will be covering the same topics, methodology, best practices, and watchouts, as well as the same case study example, just using this bottom-up approach. Before we dive into things, I just want to note that the top-down and bottom-up approaches are just two of many different options that you can use in order to understand the size of the market opportunity. And within each of these approaches, there's a number of different ways that you can think about segmenting the market in order to understand the opportunity specific to your company or your technology. The methods that we share today may not necessarily be the right fit for your company or your technology, but will hopefully provide you with some of the foundational skills that you need in order to better understand how to size the market. And we hope that you walk away with a more thorough understanding of what it means to understand the market opportunity. And so with that, Emily, I think you can advance. So before we dive into these two methodologies, let's just quickly cover and start with a question of why is market sizing important? As you can see by this lovely graphic, medical innovations obviously provide a lot of value to many different stakeholders. There's logistic value offered to clinicians, there's economic values offered to healthcare systems, payers, and investors, public health values that are offered very broadly, as well as the patient value, which is what we usually spend a lot of time thinking and talking about, especially on the earlier side of development. Now, market sizing is just one piece of the puzzle, and it really helps to explain the economic value of a medical innovation. So understanding the market size is a really critical piece of the puzzle to have in order to receive future funding. For example, with an SBIR or STTR grant application, you'll have to include a market sizing assessment as a part of that application. Strategic partners and investors will be interested in seeing the market size as a part of your pitch. And it is also important to note that future investors and strategic partners will not only be interested in what the potential opportunity is, so that number value, but also knowing that a company understands the nuances of the market, which comes with engaging with stakeholders, but also with sizing the market. And in a broader sense, market sizing information is really helpful to have in hand when you begin developing financial models and pricing out your technology. And with that, Emily, yes. So just to emphasize, yeah, market sizing really, again, helps to demonstrate the economic value of a medical innovation. Now, one question that you might be asking is, why are we covering two different approaches to size the market, and why can't I just use one? Well, both the top-down and the bottom-up approach have different utilities and limitations. So the top-down approach begins with a broad market size and considers all of the potential customers that would benefit from a technology. This approach then narrows down to a specific subsegment or niche that would benefit from your technology, and that can be realistically captured by your company. The benefit of using the top-down approach to size the market is that the data is easily available, and we'll go over some data sources that you could consider using to size the market with the top-down approach in just a bit. The top-down approach works very well for both new and established markets, and because the data is easily available, it's relatively quick to calculate. But the top-down approach also tends to be broad and may cause an overestimation of the market opportunity. In comparison, the bottom-up approach starts with a small specific market for the technology and estimates how much the product can be scaled to reach a broader population or market. Using the bottom-up approach to size the market will require you to use detailed and realistic data that you'll gather from primary sources. It also works best for established markets rather than disruptive technologies in a new market that may not have some sort of comparison that's readily available. The bottom-up approach, I'll caution, is also a bit more complex and time-consuming when it comes to the calculations. Neither of these approaches in silo will give you a complete picture of the market opportunity on its own. So that's why we recommend using both of these approaches so that you have a more thorough understanding of the opportunity and the nuances of your specific market for the technology. Now, before we dive into the top-down approach, I just want to cover a few acronyms that Emily and I will be using throughout the remainder of this presentation. And I'm sure you've heard them before, but just in case you haven't, when we say TAM, we're referring to the total available market. When we say SAM, we're referring to the serviceable available market. And when we say SOM, we're referring to the serviceable obtainable market. Those are mouthfuls, which is why we're going to be using the acronyms. And we'll cover the definitions of each of these in just a few slides. And with that, we will go ahead and dive into the top-down methodology. So for the top-down approach, you'll start with understanding the TAM. And at the highest level, the TAM represents the entire market or revenue opportunity available for a technology or for a company. Calculating the TAM is really about understanding how big the market really is, whether or not your company actually has the means to reach that entire market. For example, the TAM could represent the total number of patients for a technology's specific indication within the United States. And to understand what the total revenue opportunity is for that population to then get to the TAM, you would multiply this patient population by the average revenue spent per customer per year. And that average revenue could be based on historical data, competitor analyses, industry benchmarks, or if you've gotten to the point of pricing your technology, could also be based off of that. Next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. At the next level, the SAM represents a subsegment of the market that can be reached. And this is all about the market penetration that you can reach based on external factors, which could include competition, regulatory barriers, and supply chain limitations, for example. And estimating the SAM is really about understanding what portion of the market your technology fits into, again, based on those external factors. So for example, one way that you could think about the SAM, to keep with the previous example, if you're developing a new therapeutic, you could consider the SAM as the number of patients within an indication that don't respond to current standards of care or therapeutics today, because these patients are probably a bit more willing to try this new technology when it reaches the market. Next slide, please. Yep, wonderful. So to dive into this a little bit more, when you're developing the SAM, there are different ways that you could consider segmenting the patient population down from the TAM. And when you're making these segmentations, it's very critical to build out the assumptions that you're making as a part of the segmentation, and even including them, for example, in your pitch deck on the slide that lays out the market opportunity. Now, when you're considering how to segment the SAM, there are a number of different ways that you could think about it. You could assess the competitive landscape, and as a part of this, it would be important to consider both the current and the future competitors. And it's important to consider that future competitor, especially if there are products that would reach the market before yours, because then they will take a portion of that market share. It may also be important to consider if those new products will be competitively priced, what the target patient population of both the current and future competitors are. And these are just some important questions to, again, consider how much of the market share you could capture from the competition. Considering clinical workflows and standards of care is another important aspect. Considering how your technology, again, will fit into the clinician's current workflow, standards of care available to patients. For example, will it be used with other technologies? Will your technology be a first, second, or third line treatment? And all of these types of questions that you'll hopefully be able to answer will, again, impact the portion of the market that you can capture. Considering the purchasing preferences, not only from a patient's willingness to pay perspective and how the patient is paying, for example, out-of-pocket, private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, but also considering where different patient populations go to seek care. Is it a private hospital? Is it a public hospital? Will it be a community hospital or an academic hospital? And again, having a strong understanding of this will impact your understanding of what portion of the population your technology can reach. And finally, the target market definitions or different patient populations that you could reach. And engaging with potential customers or end users of the technology can help to validate different target populations that are most likely to benefit from the technology. And again, another assumption that could be baked into this SAM. So these are, again, just some examples, but any segmentations that you make, it is critical to, again, build out those assumptions and validate them with additional research or primary stakeholder interviews. And then finally, we get to the SOM, which is the target market that a company can realistically capture in the short term. In comparison to the SAM, which is the market that you can capture based on external factors, the SOM is really focused on the market that you can capture based on internal factors to the company. For example, your business model or distribution and sales channels. To calculate the SOM, you'll estimate a penetration rate, which is the number of customers acquired compared to the total market. Now, when estimating this, it's really important to be conservative. And Emily, if you advance one, that will pop up at the bottom. A 100% penetration rate is not expected in the short term, nor is it necessarily expected in the long term. For medical devices, for example, the penetration rate may be 1 to 5% in the first year, and then grow to 15 to 30% over time as you continue to grow and get new customers. Now, when you're developing the SOM, it's important to show what the opportunity could grow to over time, rather than just showing the potential of the technology in the first year of the market, because that growth over time will show how your business and internal capabilities will continue to grow in order to capture more of those customers. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So I know that was a lot of hypotheticals. So we'll take a couple of minutes to put this top-down approach into a quick case study for a more tangible example. So let's say that there's a new startup, DryAway, that has developed a treatment for dry mouth, and they want to understand the size of their market opportunity using this top-down approach. To understand the TAM, DryAway does some secondary research and finds a market report that indicates there are approximately 33 million in the US that suffer from 33 million individuals, in the US that suffer from dry mouth. In another academic journal, the team finds out that patients are spending about $500 annually to treat this condition. So the TAM, which is total patient population multiplied by the average expenditure, the TAM is coming out to about a $16.7 billion opportunity, which is absolutely huge. So we're going to go ahead and size that down. So DryAway then thinks about what market segment would most benefit from the treatment. So they do some additional secondary research, and they learn that about 33% of the patient population suffers from moderate to severe dry mouth. And the company thinks that that's a good fit for their first target market. They also do some more research to find out that of that moderate to severe dry mouth patient population, only about 39% of patients are actually seeking treatment. So the company understands that that's the portion of the market that they could potentially capture. So with that number in mind, the SAM, which is that $5.5 billion opportunity after it's been segmented down to that moderate to severe dry mouth patient population multiplied by the 39% that's seeking treatment, is coming out to a $2.15 billion opportunity. Finally, to estimate the SOM, Dryaway thinks about what portion of the market they could capture based on their internal capabilities. And the team decides that in about 15 years, they could expect to capture about 30% of this total market. So when you're multiplying that 30% of the market by the SAM opportunity, they get a $645 million opportunity, which, Emily, if you click, should pop up. Yep, right there. So as you can see, we based some assumptions into these slides in order to make these calculations. And again, I'll emphasize it's important to validate these assumptions as well as include them, whether it's on the slide like we have in a different kind of formatting way, or being able to voice over these assumptions if you're speaking to investors or strategic partners in the future. Now, when you're conducting the top-down approach, there are a variety of resources that can be utilized to actually gather the market data. And some of these resources include industry reports, government sources, market research reports, academic publications, healthcare organization publications, which could include anything from CDC data, professional societies and organizations that are relevant to your indication, or hospitals and clinic system publications such as the Mayo Clinic. And then there are online databases such as IBM Watson. Now, industry reports and market research reports, I understand, are often thousands of dollars to purchase, but you don't need to purchase the entire report in order to get the type of information that you need for this market sizing. With a quick Google search, you can often find press releases that reference information from these publications and may include the numbers needed. You can also review the table of contents or summaries of these reports that are available for free in order to find the type of information that you'll need in order to conduct this assessment. In addition, if you have a connection to a regional resource or you're a part of a university or have a connection to a university, you may be able to access these types of resources for free through their existing libraries or subscription databases. So to wrap things up for the top-down market assessment, I'll leave you with a few best practices and watchouts to remember as you're using this methodology. When conducting a top-down market assessment, it's best practice to consider using multiple data sources from the types of resources I mentioned in the previous slide. Different market reports and publications may have different estimates of the market size or patient population. And indication-specific publications or resources may have more nuanced information relevant to your technology that isn't necessarily available in some of the broader market reports. So being able to use and rely on multiple resources will allow you to have a more detailed and reliable understanding of the market. So just relying on one, probably not the best idea. It's important to clearly define the geographic region and indication that you are sizing the market for. For example, in our Dryaway case study, the team estimated the market size for the US since that was the first geographic market that they would be entering. Now, obviously, that's not to say you can't enter additional markets over time, but you'll want to develop those market sizing estimates separately to show that as you continue to grow your company into those different regions, that is what the opportunity would look like instead of lumping them all together to show an investor, for example. Considering how your patient population is further segmented from that total patient population is important. For example, considering if there's a population that would most benefit from your technology in the short term that maybe doesn't have their needs met by current competitors or solutions in the market. And that will help break down that total patient population in the TAM to something that's a bit more nuanced and segmented with the SAM. Considering the lifespan of the technology, or for example, how often patients may need to refill a drug, it will also be important. For example, let's say you're developing a new therapeutic and you would like to have, or you have an idea of a price point for your technology that you would like to use as the market assessment instead of using the average revenue that you found from some sort of data resource. You'll have to consider the number of times the patient will refill that drug on an annual basis and multiply that by the cost of the drug in order to understand what the potential annual revenue available to your company is. So keeping in mind whatever that lifespan of the technology is or how often patients are refilling or taking a treatment will be important for that annual revenue. We discussed utilizing university or regional resources for access to reports and market data on the previous slide. Again, I'll emphasize clearly defining and validating the assumptions as a part of your model will be important. Considering the market dynamics, as I had previously discussed, will be important. For example, again, competitors, and understanding realistically how much of the market you can capture from those solutions that are already available. And then again, showing the growth of the market over time and how more customers can be captured as your internal business capabilities continue to grow and capturing more customers. For watchouts, again, it's critical to verify the quality and the reliability of the data to ensure it is accurate and current. You won't want to use a market research report published from 5 years ago because that patient population data, for example, may not be up to date. You also won't want to consider a list of competitors from even 2 years ago because there are constantly new therapeutics and medical innovations entering the market that will continue to take portions of the market share that you are then trying to capture. So again, it's very important to consider multiple data sources when you're developing this top-down market assessment. As I mentioned earlier, again, be conservative when estimating the SOM. We often see companies overestimating. It's a common mistake, but it is very important to not overinflate the potential size of your opportunity and to really consider what is possible given the capabilities of your company and how that company capability will continue to grow over time. And avoid oversimplifying the market segmentation. So really take the time to think about how you're segmenting that total market population down to the SAM and what those patient populations would look like that you are targeting with your technology. And most importantly, I'll leave you with iterate, which is very important. As you continue to gather, additional information or data and continue to learn about the market, it's okay to continue to update the assumptions and the data used in the model in order to make sure that it is accurate and up to date. And so with that, I will go ahead and transition it over to Emily, who will be taking over the second half of this.
Thank you so much, Brailey. Really appreciate your overview of the top-down methodology. So now you've heard a high-level overview of how to start with the big picture of the market, start with your entire market landscape, and then segment down and down and down until you get that really small piece that you can realistically capture by your company or by your technology in the first couple years. So now when we're thinking about going towards the bottom-up approach and exploring that methodology, we're going to do the reverse. We're going to start with using real data and kind of primary direct feedback to understand what is that niche, what is that direct and smaller portion, your SOM that you can serve, and then extrapolating up and up and up until we understand that larger market picture. As Brailey mentioned, there are differences in these methodologies. Both are still very useful, but your bottom-up approach is going to be a little bit more complex. It's going to be more direct to your technology, and it's likely going to take more time to complete one of these exercises. A good methodology could be starting with a top-down approach to get your bearings of the market, really try to understand, the different market segments. And then once you have, the resources to conduct a bottom-up approach, moving towards that. I've mentioned data a couple times, so now let's transition to understanding how do you understand that SOM? How do you get that real world data? And so we're going to start there at the SOM. And to be able to understand the smaller portion of the market that you're going to serve, you're going to seek out direct feedback from your customers. So before you even start this exercise, you're going to want to understand what is that segment that you want to serve? What is that target segment and your target customer? Because you're going to be going out and speaking with those customers to try to start and understand your SAM. So by customers, this could mean for a medical technology end users, so your physicians, your prescribers, or it could be, purchasing committees at a hospital, for example. It could be those stakeholders that are more involved in the purchasing day-to-day aspects of that. But you're going to want to go out and have conversations with your customers to be able to understand the current state of the market and the role that your technology could play. So you want to go out and do interviews, and in these interviews, you want to capture how many patients do your customers serve on an annual basis? What are these patients spending on treatment? What is the relative hold that competitive approaches, even if it's direct competitors or just the current standard of care? What is the relative hold that these competitors hold on the market? And what is the potential for adoption of your technology? What is the role for your technology in this market? You're going to want to do more than one interview. I know it might be, tempting to get a really good, first interview and say, oh, everyone would want to use this, but you'll want to be able to have multiple data points. So then to be able to understand your sum, you're really going to want to take the average over the kind of initial sets of interviews that you do, maybe it's 5 or 6, and take account of any outliers, any extreme examples, to be able to really kind of drill into an adoption rate, a potential adoption rate for your technology that you could then multiply by the kind of annual spend that you ascertained during the interviews to understand your sum. It is possible that you could make multiple models for your sum. You could have a more conservative estimate for your sum. A couple, market research firms suggest, going out and getting your average and then halving that to get a more conservative estimate. And then you can make a more optimistic estimate, right? Maybe one of the more extremes. Multiple models can be your friend and can showcase different realities, whereas, actual reality will actually fall probably in the middle of those. And so, for example, on the slide, we've got an example where you go to a hospital and you understand how many patients that they serve annually and understand the kind of the relative hold the competitors have for that specific indication and understand how much they're spending on treatment to get that adoption rate. Once you have your adoption rate, that can be then extrapolated up, depending on your further segmentation for your SAM and your TAM. So when we're extrapolating up for your SAM, we do want to say that it should still be based in data, even though we are expanding the market, we still want to be able to kind of trace back why the extrapolation was done and where those data points came from. To keep it simple for this webinar and for the case study that you'll see in a few slides, we did a very simple extrapolation where we're just thinking about geography. So if we call back to the previous slide where we were talking about the sum was relative to a couple hospitals kind of close to maybe the business or the startup that you could access really readily with the current resources. For the SAM in this case, we're extrapolating that by geography, right? Instead of just kind of really close by hospitals and maybe in your immediate network, we're thinking regionally, right? All hospitals in the Midwest, for example. But in reality, your SAM is probably going to be a little bit more nuanced than that. It's going to take into account other demographics like age, payers like Brailey mentioned earlier, whether it's private insurance, Medicaid, Medicare. It might take into kind of where the patients are in their treatment regimen, right? Are they, is this a first line versus second line, third line, et cetera? So really your SAM could be maybe 18 to 40-year-olds that have private insurance and fail first line treatment. But for simplicity, we did want to show that kind of geographic element there for this purpose and for the case study. As you continue to extrapolate up, you should see the market continuing to grow exponentially as you kind of look outwards. So we've talked about the SAM. Again, as Brailey mentioned, for the top down, your assumptions should still be accounted for and be ready. You should be ready to justify those, defend those, and kind of trace them back to why certain assumptions were made and why certain decisions were made with the data. To kind of complete our concentric circles and take a bigger view at the total market opportunity, you take what you've learned with your exercise with the sum and with the SAM, and then apply that to the total available market, or the TAM. So when you're thinking about, calculating your TAM, ensure that you are still going back to that data point that you heard from in your sum, from the direct conversations that you had with your customers of, 20% of patients might be willing to try a new therapy. You want to make sure that this is still, obviously grounded in data, which is a key differentiator between the, bottoms up and top down approach. But for the TAM, again, we've simplified here a bit, just looking at it from a geographic lens, but of course, the same principles apply as we described in the SAM of how it's likely more nuanced. For the sum, again, we started with the hospitals that are very close to the startup, to the business that we're talking about. With the SAM, we kind of spread out regionally. And then for the TAM, you could extrapolate again to, all hospitals in the United States. So multiplying that kind of adoption rate by the cost to how many hospitals are in the United States. So I want to take a step back. We're going to cover best practices and watchouts. Want to take a step back from that quick overview of the methodology to reiterate that there's really no right way to do these different methodologies. There's a lot of different approaches that you can use. There's a reason that we call this presentation the art of market sizing versus the science. I know that a lot of us on the line are likely science-minded individuals and want a direct protocol, but this is a little bit more nuanced. And so the approach that we used is one example. You could also consider basing it more in purchasing data. So thinking about understanding all of the annual spend and different competitive approaches in your specific market, and understanding kind of the annual spend in all of those segments, understanding kind of the portion that you could capture, and then extrapolating up. So that's more based on kind of purchasing data versus the direct interview feedback that we described in our approach. But all that to say is that there are multiple methodologies, and the true and exact methodology that you'll need to use is going to be dependent on your situation. The settings that we've talked about can vary, right? The different factors and assumptions that you've used in your SAM will obviously vary depending on your technology and its unique position in the market. But we do have some best practices. Despite all that nuance, we do have some best practices and some watchouts. Of course, our methodology that we just covered is very dependent on interviews, right? So a lot of our best practices and watchouts are going to be, specific to that type of approach, but they are translatable as well. And so, I know that we are all kind of, like I said, a lot of us are science-minded. So I would say a lot of these best practices and watchouts are really akin to kind of experimental design. You have to start with good data and make sure that you're proactively putting guardrails in place to get good data. So I think, since a lot of us are scientists, that an N of 1 is not a good sample size, right? So as I mentioned, you do want to conduct multiple interviews, especially in that first determination of your sum of that, kind of small piece of the prize that you can realistically capture. You want to understand if there's potential bias in your interviews, right? And account for that prematurely and be proactive about that. You want to make sure that you're not letting extremes kind of skew your data, right? You don't want to just interview urban hospitals, for example, or university hospitals that might have more resources or might be more willing to try new therapies and new technologies versus maybe some of your more rural hospitals with less funding and less resources, for example. So make sure that you're not, skewing your data by only accounting for extremes. And you want to make sure that you're not over extrapolating, right? You want to be able to make sure that the data is leading you to the answers versus, you leading the witness when you're doing these interviews, or over extrapolating and drawing assumptions that are not indicated by the data. This is less maybe akin to experimental design, but more kind of human psychology, human-centered design maybe. It is very difficult for someone to tell a parent, for example, that their baby is ugly. We like to use that example a lot. So when you're going out and conducting these interviews yourself, you might not get as honest of feedback, right? Especially if you're leaning on your personal connections. So best practice, if the resources are available to you and you have, a third party that can conduct these interviews, it is a good practice just because you might get more direct and honest feedback. Your personal connections also can introduce bias, right? You could have your network could be more willing to adopt the technology because they know you and they know your name and your good work and trust you, right? So while your personal connections can help you get access to real world data, they could also introduce bias. And then lastly, we know that time is a valuable resource, especially for entrepreneurs and individuals that are developing technologies that have a lot of competing responsibilities. So just leverage the interviews for as much information as you can. Ask additional questions to gain other feedback about your technology, like other barriers or maybe, kind of insights around adoption that could impact the future development of your technology. As Brailey mentioned earlier, it is challenging to think about these methodologies and maybe the differences in the abstract. So we're going to go back and visit our company, Away, to see how they calculated and how they use bottom-up methodology to arrive at their market size for their technology. So starting with the sum, so again, kind of going out, speaking directly to their customer, trying to understand how much of the prize that they can capture, So Dry Away had some connections to a dentist that had 6 locations close by their office. They learned that 2,250 patients across the practice suffer from dry mouth. And these dentists believe that only about 20% of the patients would be willing to try a new treatment. Still kind of validated that they do typically spend $500 on current treatments. So in calculating the sum, you take the kind of annual spend on current treatment, so the $500, you figure out what 20% of that 2,250 patients is, which is 450 patients, which equals a $225,000 opportunity, or across the 6 locations, or a $37,500 annual opportunity per practice. And Dry Away is targeting 50 practices in their first year, which represents a $1.9 million sum. Aren't you guys glad that we did the math for you? Because doing this on the fly would not be fun. Okay, so they've got a $1.9 million sum, or serviceable attainable market. So then they're going to take that sum. They've gotten it directly from feedback from their local dentist office that they've spoken to. It's based in data, and then they're going to extrapolate for their SAM, their serviceable available market. So they did some research, and they found Dry Away is located in the Boston area. And they found out that there are around 28,000 general dentists operating in the Northeast. So again, we're simplifying this, making the extrapolation solely a geographic extrapolation. But they'll take that $37,500 opportunity per practice, multiply it by the number of practices in the Northeast to result in a $1.1 billion SAM. And then the final extrapolation, again, we'll do geographic, we'll do to the national level. Dry Away does some research and finds out there are specifically 109,280 general dentist practices across the United States. And so they use that number, again, multiply it by the opportunity per practice to result in a 4.1 billion opportunity for the total available market. So if you've been paying attention, you'll see that our top-down and our bottom-up methodology do not match. So we got different figures for each of these exercises that we did for Dry Away. So you might be thinking to yourself, to kind of call back to something that Brailey mentioned, why use both methodologies if you're just going to get different data sets? We say do not panic, first of all, that there are a couple kind of checks and balances that you can first employ, but this also kind of indicates a bigger meaning and a bigger value out of these market sizing exercises. So our first recommendation would be just check your calculations, of course. There could be a rounding error, just make sure all of the calculations are operating correctly. If that's the case, if there's a check there, that the calculations are correct, then go to your assumptions, which are baked into each model. Look at your assumptions again, understand, are these the right type of assumptions? Did we misapply an assumption somewhere? If you feel like the right types of assumptions are for each model, then you can try to understand where the overestimation occurred. This will typically happen, again, with your top-down methodology, because you are taking that bigger market size that's less specific to your technology and segmenting down. But you might have realized that, in your top-down, you estimated that, 40% of patients might be willing to try a new treatment, whereas you heard from, the feedback directly from the dentist that it's really only 20%. So that, again, is a key learning for your team as you're understanding the market dynamics. But ultimately, as we kind of take a step back, the numbers are important that you get for your TAM, SAM, and SUM. As Brailey mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, they are a critical part of receiving future funding. Partners and strategic partners, investors will be looking that you have the numbers. But the more important part is getting a really good and comprehensive understanding of the market. The more important part is being able to talk about the market, talk about the dynamics, talk about what you learned from going through this exercise, talk about the competitors, the standard of care, and really showcasing your rich knowledge of the market that you're about to enter. And in reality, your true market likely lies in the middle of the two models that you've developed. It's probably closer to the bottom-up methodology just because that is more direct feedback, that is more based in direct data from your potential customers. But it is good to have these two guardrails as you think about where your true market opportunity lies. So we'll be opening up the floor for question and answer. We're hoping to have around 15 or so minutes for that. But before we move into that, I did want to just take a step back and kind of hit our key takeaways, our key points again, before we kind of jump into a broader discussion. So we've talked about this. The title of this webinar is very intentional. We've painted a picture of a couple methodologies that you could use in understanding the market size, the market potential for your technologies, but just understand that there is a lot of different methodologies that could be used, and really the assumptions and being able to communicate your key findings and kind of understand the trail of breadcrumbs that led you to get to your market size is more important than the exact methodology that you use. So it is an art, not a science. We've hit this a couple points too, but it is better to be more conservative. Investors and strategic partners and reviewers of grant applications, they'll be looking to see if the numbers are realistic. Of course, a bigger number is obviously more attractive, but or would seem to be more attractive. But in reality, a more realistic number will get you farther in these conversations. So definitely underestimate before you overestimate. We've talked about this too. So around your assumptions, again, being able to justify why the market looks the way it does, what assumptions you baked into your model, and why you chose those assumptions will again showcase your understanding of the market and build confidence in either the reviewers, strategic partners, investors, that the market well. Brailey hit on this a little bit earlier, that markets are not static. They are constantly changing. I think we all know that with the pace of technology today. So this is not a one and done type of activity. It doesn't have to be updated every week by any means, but it should be updated on a routine basis to be able to reflect changes in the market, new technologies being launched, etc. Multiple models can actually serve you very well. Having multiple models can showcase different scenarios in which your technology and your company are still attractive, and can showcase how you might be able to play with different assumptions and kind of mix and match and showcase different market scenarios, since the future is uncertain. So don't be afraid to use multiple models, especially in conversations with partners or investors. And finally, know the limitations. A market size and a market potential don't paint the whole picture of a technology's potential. We painted it as a fourth of a pie early on in that graphic that Brailey covered at the beginning. There's a lot of other values, of course, with technologies. This is one piece to the puzzle. Again, it is critical, in certain steps and in certain development steps. But really that understanding of the market is even more important than the numbers. So while a critical part, it does not tell the whole story, and there are other ways to reflect the value of your technology. And that is all that we had in terms of kind of the lecture portion of this. So I've seen the question and answer. I think we've had questions being posed, which is great. Would love to open the floor up for a more formal question and answer discussion. So Patrick, I don't know if you want me to stop sharing and you can spotlight me, Brailey, and Shweta.
Sure, that'd be great. And thank you both for your presentation. There has been a lot of activity in the Q&A window, and our panelists have been typing in a lot of the responses. But I'd invite any of our panelists, if they'd like to come off of mute and add any context or details to some of those, that'd be great. But in the meantime, I'm going to launch a brief feedback poll before we jump into a couple of the open questions. If you wouldn't mind providing your feedback, that'd be great. But I do have a question here from David. In the bottoms-up approach, why bother with TAM? Shouldn't pro formas be based on SOM only, or what you can realistically capture?
Shweta, do you want to jump in and take that, or you want me to take a first pass? Ooh.
Yeah, happy to speak to that. So again, like Emily mentioned, Brailey mentioned, the figures that you present to your investors, your strategic partners, they're really based on the assumptions, the rationale that you've built into your model. So when you're doing your bottoms-up approach, it may not be appropriate in certain scenarios to extrapolate up to a TAM, which would obviously be covered in your top-down approach. So it really depends on your particular innovation and what is appropriate and what is communicated, but most importantly, how it's being communicated and how you're using it as a tool to demonstrate your understanding of the market. Emily, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I would just add that I do agree that the sum is likely the most important figure that you're wanting to get, and it would be the one that I would spend the most time on in either case, right? The top down or bottom up. I think that's the one that you want to be the most realistic and really kind of thought out. But agree with what you mentioned Shweta, about it's in the framing and how you're telling the story with the numbers too.
I think there was a first part to that question about a 10-year duration and whether that's reasonable. Similarly, for some innovations, the adoption curve might span over 10 years or even longer, especially if that innovation requires significant infrastructure changes or behavioral changes within the healthcare system or prescribing practices. So that time frame is going to change based on your innovation, but it is entirely appropriate, especially when you're looking at, the medical field.
Okay, next question. How do you get stakeholders and potential users to agree to an interview?
Yes, there's really no right or wrong way to do that. The simple, obvious answer is you can compensate people for their time. That is obviously a carrot that you can, we always like to say you have to dangle a carrot in front of people that you want to secure interviews with. So that's one scenario, obviously not realistic all the times to compensate every interview that you do. I think, starting with your personal network, while there is bias, that is a good way to get some initial data. And I think when you're talking about maybe doing colder outreach, going outside of your network, I think thinking about what is the benefit for this person to speak with you. They are learning about a potentially, new technology. You could emphasize maybe the benefits that the technology will offer for patients. Maybe if there's benefits to the provider, you could emphasize that, or, in general, kind of try to pique their curiosity to get them on the line. So there's a lot of different strategies in how to get people to agree to an interview. I think just trying to understand what might motivate them to want to speak to you, whether it is caring about patients, whether it is about their workflow, or thinking about trying to kind of make them curious and want to speak to you about the technology that you're working on. Brailey and Shweta, I know that you also spend a lot of time interviewing folks. What else would you add to that?
A couple of things that I would add. One, just being flexible. Obviously, if you're trying to, reach out to and engage with clinicians, as I'm sure many of you know, they're very busy people. So just being flexible and offering maybe some times before or after working hours, just as an option, not to say that they'll agree to it. And just trying to keep the conversation as short as possible. Oftentimes when Emily and I are reaching out to stakeholders, we offer, 15 to 30-minute conversation. It seems like a short amount of time, but if you're well prepared, there is a lot that you can still learn. And oftentimes, if the conversation's going well, you might have the option to stay on a little bit longer if they're very interested and have that time to spare. So I think that that's one thing that I would add. Another thing, just going back to reference about utilizing, regional resources or university resources, plugging into those networks to understand, if there are perhaps if you're in a university, maybe some master's students that could help you do this type of outreach to maybe take a little bit off of your plate, and just trying to use that network as well. So just a little bit more on the logistics side, some things that could be helpful with that kind of engagement.
Okay, next question. Actually, we have two questions kind of about market size. But the first part, given that the bottom-up approach provides smaller market sizes, can we assume that investors like to see a market size based on this approach as it gives them the worst case scenario? And then that person also wants some feedback about calculating market size based on prevalence versus incidence of diseases.
Can take that one. So to the first question, the reason that investors and strategics like to see both approaches is because both approaches give you some different information. So the value that a bottoms-up approach provides is being based on real-world data. And So in instances where the technology or the innovation being introduced is incrementally disruptive, it can be a very valuable methodology because there is going to be in a relatively busy market a lot of data to show customer purchasing preferences and trends. And so it's important, like again, I think we've been hammering this nail, is to really talk about the assumptions you've built into your models. And so it could potentially represent a worst case scenario in some instances, but think about a scenario where you're bringing something to market that's truly disruptive. Existing purchasing preferences of the patient population may not be representative of what they might do once your innovation is introduced to the market. So it's adding a new variable. And so it may not be as predictive. It may not be a worst case scenario. So it really depends. Again, what investors are looking for is less a number, less of a figure, but more of what has gone into in developing that figure. How can you use that to demonstrate your understanding of the market segment? The second question there about, oh, I don't see it anymore, but I think it was about prevalence and incidence rates and maybe which one to use. Both of those are factors in estimating the potential patient population. So prevalence refers to the total number of existing cases of a disease within a specific population at a certain time point, and incidence refers to the number of new cases that develop within a certain period. So you're going to want to factor in both when you're thinking about your patient population. Anything else, Emily or Brailey?
Yeah, I was just that last point, your incidence rate, that could be one of your assumptions, right? That the incidence will continue to stay the same, or in certain cases, maybe incidence rates will go down, right? In a condition where there might be new vaccines that are coming out, for example, or, going up. So I think that's something that you could also play around with to help build out different models too.
Okay, another two-part question here, and I think this is referencing one of the earlier slides. What did the circle represent? Was that annual revenue or total revenue over time? And then the second part of that question, what is the end timing of the planning period? You mentioned 15 years. Is that market maturity?
Do you want me to take that one?
Sure, yeah.
Shraith, if you want to take the second part first, market maturity, I need to figure out which figure was being referenced really quickly.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I quite understand this question, or if it's related to what we were talking about earlier, the 10-year adoption curve. But yeah, so as we were saying, adoption of innovations have different trajectories, different journeys. Oftentimes what we are faced with in the medical sector is having to change people's behavior, whether that's from a prescribing standpoint or adoption standpoint, even in insurance coverage and policies. So there's a lot that needs to go into the adoption process, and that can take time. So oftentimes what happens, and I think there was a question that was answered just in the chat, so I can speak to that a little bit here as well, but you kind of have a curve where you have your early adopters of a certain technology. They're the ones who are willing to take, risk. And they may be your partners during clinical trials. They may be your champions, even, while you're in development. So you've got your early adopters, and then you've got your early majority, where there's a certain number of individuals that need to be practicing something, a certain amount of evidence that needs to be generated before this segment of the population decides to try something. So that could be your early majority. And then your late majority, they require a greater number of the percentage of the population to be practicing something before they're willing to take a risk. So they're a little bit more, as you could say, risk averse. They want to see even more evidence of efficacy and safety. And so before you reach your full potential, your full adoption potential, it's going to take time. It could be 10, 15 years. That's perfectly reasonable within this space. When you're looking at technology, apps, more consumer-driven products, they have, different adoption curves themselves. They don't face regulatory hurdles or reimbursement hurdles the way medical devices or drugs face. So it is a completely reasonable trajectory. And I think the investors in this space, funders in this space are aware of that. And they know that their return on investment is going to take a little bit longer. So Brailey, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to double check. So going back to the question about what the circle represents, annual revenue or total revenue over time. So that will be the annual revenue. Because again, as Emily and I had discussed, you're multiplying that patient population or whatever that first number is by the annual revenue that patients are typically spending on that indication, for example. Or again, if you have an estimated price point of your technology, you're thinking about what that annual revenue would be for that technology based off of the lifetime of a medical device, for example, or number of times a patient would have to refill a drug or is receiving that treatment. So that's focused more on the annual revenue, again, just based off of the data that's going into that. So again, that's for not only the TAM and the total market opportunity size, but also for the SAM and the SOM, looking at the annual revenue opportunity for that company and that technology.
So we have reached the top of the hour. So I want to thank our panelists for the presentation today and the Q&A session. Before everyone logs off, thank you for providing your feedback into the poll. And also we wanted to mention that Catalyze will be hosting their next webinar on a date to be determined in May on target product profile and clinical study design. So once again, thank you to our panelists and thanks to our attendees for joining and have a good day. Thank you.